Hi, everyone. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. I love lists, and I particularly love year-end lists. So I'm happy to say that in next week's episode, we'll be presenting our top 10 books of 2022 as chosen by the editors and critics of the New York Times Book Review. This week, though, we have two great conversations from years past. The first one, from September 2019, is with the investigative reporters Megan Twohey and Jodi Kantor. A new movie based on their book, She Said, has just been released. And in our interview, former book review editor Pamela Paul speaks with the pair about the book and their initial story for the Times that eventually led to the downfall of Harvey Weinstein.
Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey join us now. They are both Pulitzer Prize-winning reporters for The Times. Their new book is called She Said, Breaking the Sexual Harassment Story That Helped Ignite a Movement. Jodi, Megan, thanks for being here.
We're thrilled to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So your book has been out for a few days now. It's already getting a lot of reaction. Has anything surprised you in terms of what people are looking at, what the reaction has been?
I think our main reaction is actually relief, because so much of the book was secret for so long, either in that it was sort of the backstory to the original Times investigation, and a lot of that was off the record and we couldn't talk about it, or for the last year or so we've had these new discoveries that we were holding for the book. And usually we're used to holding things for the newspaper for, a month, 2 months, 3 months, but we were sitting on some of this stuff for a long time. And so there's just been this incredible satisfaction in the last few days in being able to share.
Books are slow. I was going to ask about that, too, because you sort of have two processes here, the whole story behind the story of reporting and then what came after the book. At what point did you decide in the process of reporting on Harvey Weinstein and others that this was going to be a book? This wasn't just going to end with the stories in the paper.
I think that we realized pretty quickly after the first Weinstein story in October 2017 that was really just the beginning. In that first story, we had been able to piece together some of the dots of Weinstein's predation going back over the decades and how he had been able to conceal it. But there was still so much more to learn about, one, the machinery that was in place to silence his accusers and try to stop scrutiny, and also just the question of complicity. How do individuals and institutions like the Weinstein Company, for example, become complicit in abuse? And so I think we pretty quickly recognized that there was much more to say and much more to report, and that we were still grappling with a lot of questions that needed to be answered.
So there were people who would not go on the record for the stories in the paper, but then decided to let you make them public in the book. How hard was it to get them to go on the record, and sort of what made them decide to come forward publicly once this was going to be a book?
It really varied depending on the situation. I'll give you two super quick examples. Erwin Ryder, Weinstein's former accountant, he worked for him for about 30 years. He was still working for him when he became sort of the deep throat of our investigation. Very early on in the book process, we talked to Erwin about whether he'd be willing to be named. And we wanted to do that not only to kind of show our work and show how this kind of investigation works, but because Erwin's story of being a man at that company, seeing glimpses of some wrongdoing, not acting, becoming increasingly concerned, trying to intervene and failing is so key to talking about all these issues about the workplace and what you do if you see something wrong. Rowena Chu, who goes on the record for the first time in this book, she's a very sort of central Weinstein victim because there was so much cover-up involved in her story. And when we tried to reach her in the summer of 2017, she would not speak to us. She would not answer messages. There's a story in the book of me going to her house and having an incredibly awkward conversation with her husband because he did not know. She had never told him what had happened with Weinstein. So for Rowena, coming forward was a huge decision, a very careful decision, an emotional decision, and she had to make sure that she was truly ready, even 2 years after so many Weinstein victims had come forward. And it was really, Megan, I think it was only April or May that we got the news that she would be fully on the record in this book.
You mentioned getting people to go on the record, and that's one of the things that I think has brought about comparisons to All the President's Men, which is the sort of the TikTok behind the story, the how you got people to talk. And I'm curious, like going back now to your initial reporting, how hard was it to get people to go on the record to begin with?
It was extremely difficult. We were up against this kind of cloak of secrecy in Hollywood that had protected Weinstein for years. I mean, people had been in sort of hushed conversations and at parties and in the private of people's homes, people had been whispering about Weinstein and his alleged predation for years. But women were terrified to come forward with their allegations against him. He was such a powerful broker in Hollywood that people feared that they would be the ones to suffer damage to their careers and reputations if they went on the record. And then we were also up against these secret settlements that have been used to silence not just some of Weinstein's victims, but also victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault around the country. And so, you know, for example, there was a woman who had worked at Miramax in 1990. It was her first job out of college, and she was allegedly sexually assaulted by Weinstein, the boss. And, you know, right away, he kind of swooped in and forced a secret settlement on her in which she accepted money in exchange for silence. So there was a moment when I tracked her down in the course of our investigation at a home outside Manhattan and knocked on her door. She comes to the door. She's got a young daughter by her side looking up at her. And she says, I explain why I'm there. And she says, I've been waiting for this knock on my door for 25 years. But because she had been strangled into silence through this settlement, she was also terrified to speak out. And we ran into that time and time again. And so we were sort of going up both against this kind of culture of secrecy and then also these actual legal instruments that have been used to silence women.
I want to get to the legal challenges in a minute, but just talking about getting people to go on the record, obviously that was a big part of All the President's Men, and also Spotlight, the movie based on the Boston Globe reporting about the Catholic Church scandal. And two things strike me as different about this. One is that in this case, the victims are largely women, and talking about something that, I mean, I guess you could compare it obviously to Spotlight in that it's about sexual abuse, and that's something where there's a lot of shame and secrecy. But with women, there's also even more of a power dynamic. But that also you're doing this story at a moment at which journalism is perhaps as a profession more under attack than any other time maybe in recent history. And I'm curious if that second part lent to a mission of we really want to show just how careful we were and just how hard it is to do this work and what's involved.
You're exactly right. We wanted to show two things. The first is exactly what you're talking about, that we don't just throw these allegations into the paper. We wanted to show how painstaking the process is. But the second thing we wanted to show, and this became much clearer to us after we saw the impact of the Weinstein story, we wanted to show that facts really can serve as the basis for social change. When the Weinstein stories were published, including those by Ronan Farrow, so a totally independent publication.
The New Yorker.
The New Yorker was doing its own work, also came up with a devastating set of facts. And so the debate afterwards wasn't really about, did Harvey Weinstein do anything bad to women? Do we believe any of this stuff? It was about, what sort of reform does our society need? How do we need to change? How do we think about these problems differently? And so what we find hopeful about this book is that we want to show people that even at a time when so much is stuck and when the notion of truth almost seems to be fracturing, reporting still can make a difference.
So Harvey Weinstein, as you alluded to here, he was known widely behind the scenes to be not a good guy. And yet many other news organizations tried to get this story. What made you guys think that you could do it where they failed?
That was part of the enticement.
Yeah. Well, and I think listen, I think it's also a testament to, if you're talking about the kind of media landscape in America right now, I think it's worth pointing out that it's not just that the president is calling the press, the enemy of the people. The media landscape has also suffered serious financial hits. And so there are a lot of news organizations that have been required to shrink and cut their resources. And I think that here at the New York Times, we were just so grateful to have an institution that was able to put the time and the resources behind this type of investigation. I mean, there were moments along the way, as we describe in the book, where we weren't even sure we were going to be able to obtain the truth and get to the finish line. And there were times where we'd knock on people's doors and they'd say, listen, you're not the first journalist to come knocking. And I worked with, another reporter back in the day. And guess what? That story went nowhere.
Did that make it even harder then for people to sort of go through the trauma of all this?
I think it was a challenge. I think that there was I think we ran into some skepticism with some of these phone calls and some of these door knocks when there were people who had spoken to other journalists only to see those investigations fail. And what we'd say is listen, we can't tell you what's happened in these other scenarios. All we can tell you is that we're sort of showing up with the whole support of the New York Times behind our back all the way up to the top of the institution.
I think that another thing people don't really have a good idea about is all of those stories that sort of don't quite make it into the paper because you can't get people to go on the record, you can't get the corroboration that's necessary. I'm curious how the two of you got started on this because, Megan, you had been reporting when Donald Trump was still a candidate on accusations that came forward. Had you two worked on any stories together before, and how did that happen that both of you began working on this one?
No, we barely knew each other. Megan had joined the Times. You joined the Times in 2016.
2016, yeah.
Right, and I had been here a lot longer. And so we had met, and I think maybe we had coffee or lunch once or something, but we really did not know each other. And the truth is that I didn't think Megan was that friendly. It turns out that she
rough crowd.
It turns out that she was just very intently focused on her Trump reporting, of course, during the 2016 election. But Megan was on maternity leave in the spring of 2017 when I started on the Weinstein story. And I was all alone on a very difficult story. And Rebecca Corbett, our editor, said to me one day, I think you should call Megan Twohey for advice. She's done a lot of this kind of reporting. And on that first phone call, something really did click between the two of us. But then there was some suspense because Megan wasn't going to be back from maternity leave for a few weeks, and she had the choice of what to work on. And I really hoped she would come work with me on this.
Well, this is something that people don't talk about a lot, which is the fact that as reporters are doing their job, they also have families. Maggie Haberman has 3 kids. You have 3 girls between the two of you, and both of you did this while you had very young daughters. And this is incredible, stressful reporting. What was that like doing this? And I imagine you're, going home and feeding your baby at night.
Yeah, I mean, spoiler alert, yes, it was hard. But this really was a moment in which we would be spending our days tracking down sources and, trying to obtain documents and then going home to sleep train. So
that kind of puts things into perspective. Which was harder?
Yeah, sometimes people will ask me, were you guys ever scared of Harvey Weinstein? And I always say, there's one person I'm scared of. She's 2.5. She's the one person who can intimidate me and bully me. There are so many reporters, investigative reporters, other types of journalists, and just working folks across this country who do tough jobs with, balancing parenting with this work. And I think that what we realized is that I think especially with the issues of sexual harassment and sexual assault, and I think you see this now kind of in the midst of the Me Too era, is that all parents, whether it's parents of daughters, parents of sons, actually feel that much more committed to this issue because they want to make sure that their kids are growing up in a world with adequate protections and fairness. And so while parenting could feel like a challenge at times, it was also a motivating factor.
Jody, you mentioned you've been at the Times for a while and you've done a lot of different things. One of them was reporting on the challenges that women who particularly work at hourly jobs like, Starbucks have to take care of their children, to do basic things like nurse and pump while they're working full time. But you've also been the editor of Arts and Leisure. You reported on the Obamas. You reported on Amazon. Was there anything different about this story that from what you had previously done at the paper that sort of made you think okay, this is something entirely new here, or a particular challenge that you hadn't encountered before?
I think what might be surprising is that this investigation felt like something bigger from the beginning, not even really because of Weinstein, but because of the context here in this building, which is that in the spring of 2017, Emily Steele and Michael Schmidt broke the Bill O'Reilly story. They were able to show that O'Reilly and Fox had paid women off for many years to silence accusations of sexual harassment. And then the really astonishing thing is that after we published the story, O'Reilly lost his job. And the idea that a figure that powerful could be fired, not because of those allegations, because Fox had known about those allegations, but because of public exposure of those allegations, was like a real, hey, wait a minute moment at the paper. And the editors asked a question that now sounds a little quaint, but they asked, are there other powerful men in American life who have covered up stories of abuse? And so we worked with a whole team. There were reporters looking at Silicon Valley, Katie Benner. There were reporters like Susan Chira and Katrin Einhorn did the story about the Ford factory workers. We were making inquiries about academia. We were looking into restaurant workers. And so from the beginning, the focus was really on looking at these issues across industries. And also the two words that came up really early in the process were complicity and enablement. The project from the beginning was conceived not as this industry or this predator or that predator, but there's a structural problem here. There's a systemic problem here. And so even those early first few months of Weinstein investigation always played out in that context, in our own building and in our own meetings. So the fact that now, 2.5 years later, we're having this really broad social conversation about, for example, secret settlements, that is so gratifying because back then we sat in these conference rooms and said, are we really going to be able to get people interested and understand these obscure legal instruments?
I mean, a lot of it does seem to hinge on money. And when, in cases like O'Reilly, that it sort of becomes a question of, well, will the advertisers pull out? Like, are we going to lose money in this? And as you mentioned earlier, there was a lot of complicity on the part of all of these organizations, generally for-profit companies, in terms of having non-disclosure agreements, threatening people with legal team. And another thing, Jody, that you bring to this that is a bit unusual for most journalists is that you went to law school.
Well, I actually dropped out of law school. I was a journalism junkie, but never sort of gave myself permission to think that I could actually be the one writing the stories or editing the stories. I thought you'd have to be a total narcissist to think that you could do that. But I did drop out of law school when I realized that I wanted to give myself a shot at journalism. But, I've been thinking about it more recently because this reporting and this book has caused us to really struggle with these questions about the law. As a lot of people have pointed out, lawyers like Lisa Bloom and David Boies do not come out looking well in this story. And I think that part of what we're grappling with is this deeper question of the law is supposed to be our arbiter of right and wrong, but is it functioning in that way on these issues, or has it abdicated its role?
Well, lawyers here for the New York Times played a major role in this investigation, right? You had to have the power of the institution in terms of helping you confront some of these figures, dealing with what do we do if the person has a non-disclosure agreement? Again, going back to the sort of tick-tock of this story, how important for you was it to show everything that's involved in a big investigation like this?
We thought it was extremely important, and I think that it's unusual for readers to actually get the sort of behind-the-scenes look at how we do this work. And so we spent a lot of time in the reporting of the book and figuring out ways to get, for example, off-the-record meetings that we engaged in the course of our reporting onto the record so that readers could see for themselves. They could be in the room when Harvey Weinstein barged into the New York Times the day before the story was published.
Were you scared?
No, not scared. I think we were just scared that, in the process of working with his high-powered lawyers and the private investigators that he had promised $300,000 to if they could bring a halt to our investigation, we were worried for our sources. We were worried that he was going to be able to do something to try to kind of manipulate all the hard work we had done off the page. And so it wasn't so much scary, but it felt like the final 2 days leading up to publication were just a total wild ride. And so one of the more dramatic moments was when he did, in fact, barge into the New York Times with lawyers, including Lisa Bloom and Linda Fairstein and Elkin Abramovich by his side. And he had, he came in with these folders full of information, photos of some of his accusers and friendly poses with Weinstein and other information that he thought he might be able to use to smear them and be able to stop our investigation. That was something that had taken place off the record. He had basically showed up to the Times unannounced. And so we worked really hard to get that meeting onto the record so that readers could be in the room with us as that played out. That's just one example. There were other examples like, Jody had worked with Erwin Ryder, the accountant, who ended up serving as a deep throat figure in the investigation. And so to be able to show readers what it was like when she was meeting with him in these sort of hushed meetings at a restaurant in Tribeca, this is just one of the examples of all the kind of behind the scenes action that happens as you're trying to get an investigation like this to the finish line that I think readers will be surprised to see.
I want to end with both where this book ends and also with where it began, because Megan, you, as you mentioned, were looking into allegations against then candidate Donald Trump in 2016, and you end with Christine Blasey Ford. In both of these instances, the accusations did not result in the accused being brought down. What's the difference?
Well, one thing we've seen again and again is that there's a big difference with how these stories play out in the political sphere versus the non-political sphere. If you look at the O'Reilly story, the Weinstein story, Louis C.K., Les Moonves, a lot of the sort of big Me Too journalistic investigations that were non-political, they were very complicated and people had heated opinions, but they didn't play out on the gladiatorial battlefield of American politics. Then let's look at the political stories for a second. Not only Trump and Kavanaugh, but let's go back to Bill Clinton. Let's go back to Clarence Thomas. Those stories turn into holy wars where they take on all of the energy and poison of these big political fights, and it can sometimes feel like it's not even about the women anymore at the end of the day.
Do you think it's also about the fact that there isn't any bottom line to worry about, that there aren't those advertisers, the sort of money that will get pulled that will make it easier for someone to make a decision, okay, this person has to go?
One of the interesting questions that came up in the last couple of years was, what if Donald Trump hadn't run for president? And what if the Me Too era had taken off in earnest with all these other men being held accountable for their behavior? What would have happened to Donald Trump if he had faced all these allegations at a time when he was still just running his company and running The Apprentice? Would there have been consequences then?
It's a very good question. I suspect that neither of you is done with this investigation. Are you still looking into stories around Me Too?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Our attitude is that you can't solve a problem you can't see. So Megan and I can't adjudicate all of the controversies around Me Too. But what we can continue to do is bring information to light in a responsible way and uncover this secret history that so many of us are still trying to understand.
Are women still reaching out to you?
We got a new wave when the book was published.
Then to be continued. Jody, Megan, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Jody Kantor and Megan Twohey are the authors of the best-selling book, She Said, Breaking the Sexual Harassment Story That Helped Ignite a Movement.
Our second conversation from December 2020 is with Neal Gabler, who spoke with us about his book, Catching the Wind, Edward Kennedy and the Liberal Hour. Gabler's just released the sequel, Volume 2 of his Ted Kennedy biography, which is called Against the Wind, Edward Kennedy and the Rise of Conservatism.
Neal, thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the first question I always have when I'm looking at the first of a 2-volume or 3-volume biography is, did you know from the get-go that that's the way this was going to work out? Or did you think you were writing a 1-volume book and it just became clear that it couldn't be contained?
I thought it was going to be a 1-volume book until fairly recently, in fact. I intended the book to be 1 volume because I think there's a thematic line that runs through it. And I wanted the book to have that kind of integrity, both narratively and thematically. But we got to the point where my publisher, Crown, came to me and said that they thought it would be advisable to divide it into two, that the book would simply be too large. Volume 2 is larger than Volume 1. So it would have been a book of roughly 1,500 written reading pages, exclusive of footnotes and bibliographical material and all of that. So when they approached me with that, they let me make the decision. I thought about it long and hard because, again, I think about these books and I try and craft these books, and it was a single volume in my mind. But when I examined it, I thought, there is a breaking point here. And the breaking point is that so much of what happens up to 1975 is Edward Kennedy riding the wind or catching the wind, the liberal wind. And then what happens afterward is really Edward Kennedy sailing, as he said in a very famous speech of his, against the wind. And I thought, well, it's appropriate then that we divide this into two volumes, and that we tell the story of the ascendance of liberalism and the story of the decline of liberalism, each volume dealing with those things respectively.
Well, it's interesting then that this ends in 1975. One might think of that as a more conservative period given Nixon's election. So why 1975 is the kind of end point of this liberal hour before you go to the against the wind part of this biography?
Well, Richard Nixon advanced conservatism, but with Watergate, he also set it back. And liberals in the 1974 midterm election, liberals gained power, Democrats gained power, and so they got a kind of respite. Really, they got a second breath after the heyday of the liberal hour in the 1960s, mid 1960s, during the Great Society. So they got their second wind. But by 1975, when Gerald Ford was in power, that second wind was already beginning to die. And the book ends, I don't want to give I should give a spoiler alert here, but I don't know that it's necessary when you're dealing with political history. But the book ends with an episode that, I think is really kind of salient. And that is the episode of the anti-busing protests in Boston in 1974 and into 1975, when the Irish and Italian white Bostonians marched to oppose a court-ordered busing integration. And Ted Kennedy was kind of caught betwixt and between, because these ethnic whites were Ted Kennedy's people. These were the people who had always supported the Kennedys. But on the other hand, the Kennedys were, and particularly Ted Kennedy, were great supporters of the African American community. And so Ted was caught in a kind of pincer between these two forces. And though he was not adamant about the court-ordered busing, it wasn't as if he went out there and said, you got to do this. He was adamant about integration. And what that caused, and this is, again, the concluding episode in the book, and I think it's a very, tense episode, and a very terrifying episode for Ted Kennedy, is these crowds literally turned on him and chased him and threw things at him and beat him. One of them had a standard with the American flag, and they shoved it at him and poked him like a spear. And Ted Kennedy, this is literally true. Ted Kennedy literally had to run for his life, and he escaped into a MTA station, a subway station, where his aides held back the crowds who were going after him. And fortunately for him, a train arrived just as he escaped into the station, and he jumped on that train. And even then, the crowds retreated and tried to follow, and they jumped in their automobiles and followed that train. But this was an episode that in some ways was the harbinger of what was to come, which was the anger of white ethnic America at the liberal agenda.
So going back to that initial question about these two volumes, it sounds like you had already written the entire thing when this decision was made to divide it into two.
I had, yes. The both books. Well, I didn't think of them as both books, but the book was complete. And volume 2 will be published next year, a year after volume 1. So I had in my mind, I knew exactly where I wanted the book to go when I started it. I know Robert Caro says that he always writes the last sentence first, but basically what I do is I outline the entire book. In this case, it turned out to be 2 books, but I knew exactly where this book was going. I knew where every chapter was. I knew where virtually every beat in the book was, because that's how I write. I believe, Pamela, in a kind of metaphysics of writing, by which I mean that readers can detect the process of your writing. They know when you're struggling. They know when you're hitting bumps. And I do everything in my power to preload a book so that there are no bumps. And that the book, I like to think, reads almost musically, because I've done so much preparation that when I actually sit down to write, I write very quickly, astonishingly quickly to my editors and even my agent, so that the book just flows, because I want the book to just absolutely flow.
This is going to be very painful for many of the writers and aspiring writers who listen to us to hear. But this isn't your first biography, of course. You've written biographies of Walter Winchell and Walt Disney, most notably. I'm sure each of them has their challenges. What were the particular challenges of writing a biography of Ted Kennedy? There have been many, many books about the Kennedys. Ted has written his own memoir. What was the biggest challenge for you?
Well, that's a challenge, of course. When there are other books out there, I would never write a book where I felt, and this is not an insult to any other writer who's written about Kennedy, not by any means is it an insult, but if I felt that any previous biographer had done what I intended to do with this book, I wouldn't have written the book. I'm not that egocentric that I think, well, I'm going to be better than everybody else. I approached this book as a biography of Edward Kennedy, but also equally a biography of American liberalism. So there was that challenge. But the biggest challenge in this book is I hate to write without papers. I hate to write without complete access to everything. And when I wrote about Walter Winchell, all of his papers were being auctioned, and I actually went to the auction house and I spent several weeks, because that's all I had, going through every document I could with a tape recorder from morning till night. The auction house let me stay there, and I spent God knows how many hours doing that. When I wrote about Walt Disney, the Disney archive, I spent years literally in the Disney archives going through all of Walt Disney's papers, from the deed that his great grandfather had in Canada to the last papers before his death. Here, the papers were all sealed, and they were only now being opened. And I hated the idea of writing a biography without papers. But there was also another challenge, and that was that the Kennedy family was not cooperative. I would never write an official biography. That is something I would never, ever do. It's just not how I do that. I'm not an authorized biographer. But it was difficult because although the Kennedys are secretive and they operate, as I say in the book, under a kind of code of omerta where nobody talks about anything, still in all, I love to sit down and conduct lengthy interviews. And I was able to get some of those, but with only one family member, and that was Patrick Kennedy. Patrick Kennedy, the younger son, I should say, of Edward Kennedy, was the only one who was very generous with his time. I spoke with Ted Jr., but he finally decided not to cooperate, and I didn't get any cooperation from Vicky, and that was difficult. But I finally made the decision, and I wrestled with this decision. I finally made the decision that I didn't think the book would be significantly different without having those interviews, because they had given interviews to the oral history, the Edward Kennedy oral history at the Miller Center at University of Virginia. I had access to all of those interviews, and they'd been interviewed numerous times in various other places, and I read all of those. So in the final analysis, I bit the bullet and I said, I'm going to proceed with the book even without that material.
So just a note to listeners, Vicky is Ted Kennedy's widow, and she's still alive.
Oh, yes, she is, and still active.
That was one of my questions about access because, of course, as you say, they famously deny access to almost everyone. If you had known going in that they were not, by and large, going to talk to you, do you think you would have even embarked on the project? Or did you go in thinking you would get them on board somehow?
I always think that I'm going to get the cooperation of the family. When I wrote Walter Winchell, the family was very difficult to find, frankly. But in the final analysis, they did cooperate. His granddaughter cooperated with me. In the case of Walt Disney, Diane Disney Miller, Walt Disney's daughter, sole surviving daughter, would not speak to me for, I would say, the first 6 years that I worked on the book. But finally, I got a phone call from her. And she said that she would cooperate. And I flew out to San Francisco, which is where she lived. And she was very cooperative, though it turned out in the final analysis, she didn't like the book. But and many of the things she didn't like were the very things she told me, which I always thought was somewhat ironic. But I was hoping in this case that I would get that. I'm not sure whether I would have proceeded had I known that the family would be uncooperative. But again, once I was into the project, I told myself that, the book would not be, as I said earlier, significantly different, that I had so much material. I had talked to so many people. I had read so many interviews that I felt I had the material I needed to tell the story I wanted to tell. Now, obviously, the book would have been different had Vicki Kennedy sat and talked to me, or Ted Jr., but you play the hand you're dealt, and that was the hand I was dealt.
We all think we know. We all have images of sort of what each Kennedy was like. How would you characterize Kennedy coming out of your research for this book? And did anything surprise you about him as a man, as a person?
A lot of things surprised me. I think I came into this book. I try never to prejudge. I never write hagiography or demonography. I mean, I try and take the story where it leads. And though I admired the Kennedys, I didn't particularly feel that this was going to be, I was going to genuflect before them. But I always thought of Ted Kennedy the way that I think most people thought of Ted Kennedy. He was a hugger. He was a glad hander. He was boisterous. He was more a Fitzgerald, speaking of his grandfather, Honey Fitzgerald, who was at one time a congressman and a mayor of Boston, who was also a glad-handing retail politician. I always thought of Ted Kennedy that way, the happiest of the Kennedys, the least complicated of the Kennedys, and I have to admit, the least intelligent of the Kennedys, which was the general characterization of him. I found, I spent over 10 years on this book, that characterization was partially correct. Yes, he did love retail politics. He was a hugger. He was a glad hander. He was in many ways more Fitzgerald than he was a Kennedy. But I also found that was misleading. Ted Kennedy was a very complicated man. He was a very melancholy man in many moments of his life. We see, and I say this explicitly in the book, we see the public Ted Kennedy, this boisterous figure, but we don't see the private Ted Kennedy, the one who would spend hours staring out at the sea, the one who was a fatalist, who believed that as his brothers were killed, he would be next, who was certain that he was going to take an assassin's bullet. We don't see that Ted Kennedy. We don't know that Ted Kennedy. We don't know the Ted Kennedy who spent hours and hours and hours poring over legislation and learning, going to Harvard professors to be tutored to get the background for legislation so that he could debate on the floor of the Senate with the very best of them. And he became one of the best of them. We don't know that Ted Kennedy. We saw the tip of that iceberg, but there was so much of that iceberg that was under the water. And that was the Ted Kennedy who, in many ways, to me, was not only unfamiliar, but in many respects, the real Ted Kennedy, the deep, melancholic, fatalistic Ted Kennedy. And he dominates the book.
Your title here is Catching the Wind. It sounds like the title of your next volume might be Against the Wind. The title of
It is the title.
It is the title. Okay, there we go.
It is.
And the title of Kennedy's own memoir was True Compass, which I thought was a really interesting book, but obviously all of them sailing metaphors. But two questions. One is, what was the role of sailing? Obviously, it sounds like it was very central to Ted Kennedy, but also, how accurate was his own memoir? You talk about the melancholy and tragedy in his life. Did you think that he knew himself well, and did he portray that? Did that come through in True Compass?
I'll hold the nautical metaphors for a moment because they are important and they're a key, I think, to understanding Ted Kennedy. And the Kennedys are known for, because they were trained by their parents to be resilient, stoic, facing tragedy. I don't want any sourpusses, Joe Kennedy would say. No tears in the Kennedy family, Joe Kennedy would say. And so when they faced these tragedies, what we saw was that face of stoicism. I think there's some of that in True Compass. Kennedy reveals himself, but like all Kennedys, he only reveals himself so much. And there's a wonderful line I quoted in the book that I think it was Timothy Shriver, one of the Kennedy cousins, the son of Sergeant Shriver, said to Patrick Kennedy, which is the family pathology is secrecy. Everything was secret, including emotion, and you never revealed emotion. There is some of that kind of circumspection in True Compass. But there is also something else in True Compass. There are moments of self-reflection. I don't think that until the end of his life, he was a terribly introspective or self-reflective individual, because I don't think he wanted to allow himself that. I think he was afraid of what he would find. There's a story that Patrick Kennedy told me where he and his father had had an argument, and he had disappointed his father in some sense. And Ted Kennedy, unable to express fully what he wanted to express to his son, or perhaps, holding in his emotion, took him into the library, and he took down a volume of The Enemy Within, which was Robert Kennedy's description of the racket committee hearings, which Robert Kennedy was the majority counsel during. And he opened the book, and it was inscribed by Bobby to Ted. And he said, to my brother Teddy, who has his own enemies within. And I think Ted understood that he had his own enemies. He was fighting those enemies. And to be too introspective would loose those enemies.
What were those enemies?
I think part of it was his own sense of his own fallibility, his own sense of his lack of worth, which I think he lived with all of his life. The single most important line, I think, in True Compass, and the most introspective line probably in the entire book, although it's something of a throwaway line, is I never felt I was the equal of my brothers. Well, he felt that way. His family felt that way. The general public felt that way. And I think it was a very difficult thing for him to contend with, that he was so fallible, that he wasn't a great man. And he wanted so much to be a great man because the legacy of the Kennedys imposed by Joe Kennedy was greatness. You have to be great. You have to be great. Now, ironically, I think most people, well, maybe not most, but many, many people would say that he turned out to be, in terms of the things he contributed to the public weal, the greatest of the Kennedy brothers. But he never felt that way. And he strove to want to feel that way, but he couldn't.
Let's end on something you brought up earlier, which is the nautical metaphor. What role did sailing play in his life?
Well, first of all, the sea played a great role in his life. I said he wasn't the most introspective of men, and he wasn't. But he was very introspective about the sea, that it continues on forever. It's unchanging. You can't conquer it. You only can submit to it. And that was the way he saw life. This was a man who believed he could accomplish great things, but also understood the parameters about those things. I think Ted Kennedy saw the sea sort of the way that Robert Kennedy or Camus saw the sun. The sun taught him that everything isn't history, that there are larger forces in the world, and that you have to deal with those forces.
All right. Well, clearly, we will have to have you back on to talk about Volume 2. We didn't even mention Chappaquiddick, obviously another a whole big subject unto itself and not unrelated to what you're talking about. But we'll leave it here for now. Neal, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you again for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Neal Gabler's new book is called Catching the Wind, Edward Kennedy and the Liberal Hour, 1932 to 1975, the first in a 2-volume biography of Ted Kennedy.
Those were our interviews with Megan Twohey and Jody Kantor from 2019 and Neal Gabler from 2020. We look forward to presenting our top 10 books of 2022 next week. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.